We're starting a new unit, and in this unit, drastic changes occur in the world, the era of democratic revolutions. And in doing so, we're going to examine the root of these democratic revolutions in an event called the Enlightenment. So we're going to trace the changes and continuities over time that would lead to these revolutions that will alter not only nation states, but people all across the globe. But first, if you could go and open up in your Google Classroom, there's a series of lecture questions, one and two, two graphic organizers, one of which will talk about the initial condition that exists in the past and the changes that occur in Europe and eventually elsewhere. So go ahead and take a look at number one. We're going to answer these after the content of this lecture. There are a number of changes, and before we do so, we're going to examine the global setting before taking a look at and viewing in on Europe, and then we're going to define the Enlightenment and some of the old ideas that it challenged as well. First of all, observe this graph that's listed here. So this is about the ancient past and the classical past as well. So in doing so, if you're looking at this graph here, we look at places like China and India and so forth being some of the primary producers, the civilizations that are generating the most, and not only that, creating goods that are coveted by people across the globe. European states, France, Britain, Germany, Italy, and so forth here provide a small amount until the 20th century. So revolutions are going to change these societies that will in a lot of ways have flipped this particular script. And you can see it in this particular time period here as well. It continues into the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Okay. One characteristic of most, if not all, of these societies is the concept of absolutism, where monarchs gather wealth and power of their either small little region or what we call a nation state for themselves and also for the benefit of that particular state. And so these absolute rulers control a number of things. One, they're able to influence the traditional elites of society, the landed nobility. So in other words, people who receive status and power based on a birthright. And over generations, they're able to generate not just wealth, but then also a traditional sense that they are everybody's social betters, that they get to control others and so forth. And so a drastic change that occurs in the 16th and 17th century is that even these people are now going to be controlled by these new absolute kings. And so the kings are centralizing power and social influence as time progresses. Secondly, they start to control finances over the nation. There's a policy called mercantilism, whereby if a country establishes colonies across the globe, they're going to use those colonies to enrich the state, enrich the power of the capital city, so that these nation states and these kings can start to generate foreign policy for their own benefit. And oftentimes they're getting support from non-nobles, many of which are merchants that are thriving in this new era of global trade. And then thirdly, with that resource and with that money and with the status over the nobility, they're able to centralize power. So they're going to start to hire bureaucrats, people who work for the government, and actually pay them a decent wage to implement and execute the will of a king. Because really, it's one thing to say, hey, you know what, I'm in charge, I'm in power. It's another to be able to have that word being spread across vast lands. And then secondly, to have people actually follow that as well. And so you need people at the local levels to do so. And so a large bureaucracy is created. And with the control of these finances, they're able to create large standing armies that will either defend the state or execute the will of the king elsewhere and perhaps conquering other lands. So the two case studies that we've looked at previously are France and Russia. So in homework assignments previously, you've taken some notes that might look something like this, where we looked at, first of all, France under King Louis XIV, this case of absolutism, and hopefully you're able to take some notes. And it also generate a response and answer to this question in the comments. The next section is about Russia. And so you examined a second case study in Peter the Great and the new state of Russia emerging as a powerful, a Western style state. So hopefully you're able to see Peter as the Tsar of Russia doing very unique things for his country in order to expand further west. Okay. All the while, though, there is an era and a movement of social and intellectual conservatism in some of the most powerful states of the past. The Ottoman Empire, one of the states that we studied in the first unit, is starting to move away from the scientific and technological discoveries that really made it a regional power. An example of this is the Ottoman Observatory, where a scientist created an observatory to view the stars and to measure distances and times and so forth would eventually be dismantled because of an opposition from an Ottoman sultan, not necessarily because he's anti-science, but this is oftentimes attributed as the starting point of where Ottoman sciences start to fall behind what we are seeing in the West. Okay? Another example of this is what happens in Ming and Qing China, where at one point the Emperor of China sends out one of his men, a man by the name of Zheng He, in this massive treasure fleet to exact tribute all across the Indian Ocean, where China is spreading its influence and power across the Indian Ocean, such that it is beyond the regions and the borders of China, all throughout Afro-Eurasia. However, they will stop. And the next emperor says, look, this is too costly. We can't continue to do so. So a possibility of an age of discovery stemming from China never happens. Instead, China, realizing that its borders are big enough, says, hey, you know what? We're just going to leave things as is. And so the type of expansion that is going to happen and is happening with Europe at this time overseas does not happen in the two most powerful and culturally and economically relevant states in society. Okay. So much so that when European merchants, a man by name of Lord Macartney from England, engages with the Emperor of China, Kangxi, Kangxi basically pushed him aside and says, hey, you know what? We're China. You follow the rules that we dictate and not vice versa. And so we get this sense of social, intellectual conservatism and isolationism that is starting to creep up in the powerful societies of Asia. In Europe, however, things are starting to change. And we see this with a previous activity that we did in class, the incremental rise to the West, the scientific revolution, whereby logically, reasonably, European scientists are starting to figure out the world. And this is going to lead not just simply to technological growth, but also an evaluation of what makes sense socially as well, because many things that European societies are generating are still looking backwards and into the past. Okay. And so therefore, there are some historical changes that is going to challenge some of these notions in Europe. Okay. On the left-hand side is what we call the old regime Europe. This is a term that's oftentimes used in France. Okay? And so we're going to go through each one of these segments here, okay, of what defines, what is our initial condition for a comparison that we have here, and then the events that will, in the end, draw some drastic changes in Europe that would alter it in a way such that is in a trajectory of growth and innovation. So we're going to look at these individually, starting with the religious aspects that are changing. The first of which is the Protestant Reformation. In the Protestant Reformation, you have a priest by the name of Martin Luther, a Catholic monk, actually, who will start to challenge some of the beliefs of the Catholic Church, that it is, on one hand, an all-powerful church that's based on the power of the clergy. And so what Martin Luther does is he's saying, look, there's a lot of corrupt practices, one of which is the selling of things like church positions, or even what we call indulgences. In other words, if you want to be saved, you must give to the church. And so Martin Luther says, look, this is not Christian. This is not what the Bible is stating. So in his particular challenge, it's going to inspire many others to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church. And so it temporarily it leads to a division of this of Western Christendom, a major war that will last for about 30 years, where most of the major powers will fight against one another, and it's devastating to Europe, and it's going to reduce the population of Europe dramatically. However, its change is going to result in what is known as the Protestant church. Not a single church, but a lot of different branches that will have their own beliefs, many of which are going to generate from their own reading of the Bible. And so what it results in is not just simply that war, but it's going to weaken the power and the influence of the Catholic Church. A second event, which will challenge the traditional notion of landed aristocracy and that connected connection of the serfs who end up serving these nobles in sort of a social contract. This is going to decline in the building of the European nation state. As many of these kings become much, much more powerful, they're going to create a centralized government that will rule over the traditional domains of the aristocracy. And in these nation states, they're going to have certain characteristics. The first of which is that they are sovereign. In other words, they determine their fate of their own state. No one else does. So the rulers will make their decisions within the scope of these defined borders. In other words, the states will contend with other states, but within our own borders, we do our own thing. They are sovereign under the leadership of a central government. But to add to this here, in traditional European societies, you are oftentimes defined by who your lord is, right? They are your social betters. They will determine whether or not you get to travel, what kind of education you get, whether you can marry, whether you can leave, and so forth. And so it's usually you are a lot of it owned by a lord. They commanded so much of your life. And so what starts to break down with the nation state is that your identity isn't connected to that lord or that locality. Instead, it's oftentimes either to a king or more so an identity that belongs to the state. And so the identity of being English or French or Spanish or Portuguese or Dutch, right, will start to grow. You don't belong to a lord. You may not even belong to a king, but your identity is based upon either this racial or cultural identity of being a part of a nation, a group of people with a shared history, maybe a shared language, and a shared past. So instead of being a lord's man, you are a man to these particular states. And such that by Europe in 1700, we start to see many of these smaller domains here be unified into these larger nation states. A third element is in feudalism, which I mentioned before, where you are tied to a particular lord. That lord kept you from traveling far away from home. Many people actually may never go 10 to 20 miles from their homeland. With European colonialism, we start to see movement of Europeans across the globe. And it's not just simply across different parts of your own nation state, but as European colonies start to settle overseas, there's a chance of Europeans to actually own their own land, to go overseas to find new abilities to be able to have a different livelihood and maybe separate themselves from the traditional aristocracy that had controlled them for generations. Okay. Lastly, feudalism did not encourage education, and the Catholic Church often discouraged, sometimes, not always, scientific discoveries and innovations. Uh, with the building of examining the ancient past during the Renaissance and what is known as the scientific revolution, that starts to change. Okay. The Renaissance, again, where Europeans are starting to rediscover the ancient past, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, and their view of using logic to examine the world has led to the scientific revolution. Again, we explored this in a previous activity. And from that scientific revolution of discovery, of experimentation by a rational process, people aren't just simply going to examine the world, the scientific, the rational world, the physical world, but also society as well, religion, the power of the state, and other traditions as well. And all of this is going to lead to the Enlightenment. So, what I'm going to have you do is to go ahead and, based off the content that we've just discussed here, be able to describe one change that's occurred in Europe prior to what we call the Enlightenment. So, those four things that we mentioned, select one, describe the initial condition, and then describe the change in Europe. So, don't just simply rewrite what's on screen here, but actually think about what's spoken and be able to make that answer in complete sentences. So pause the video here and answer this question. So now that you're back here, and you'll note that the notion of absolutism, a king, will still exist almost everywhere. And so, under what is known as the Enlightenment, we will start to see challenges to this traditional authority. So what happens in the Enlightenment is this. Those in the middle class, without aristocratic status, by the way, the wealthy, the one who have time on their hands, the educated, and also other aristocrats who also have time on their hands because they're not doing any work, other work, and other educated individuals are taking a look at and using the scientific methods of logic, of reason, and applying it to human society. So, in other words, this process of scientific investigation, they're going to use this and say, hey, can we make conclusions about how we govern, how we interact with one another? And so, in the 18th century, they will gather together in the major cities of England, in Italy, in France, in salons, and salons aren't where you do your hair. No, there are places where people gather to talk and to discuss. Oftentimes at tea and coffee shops where there's a little bit of caffeine that will allow their discussions to go deep into the night, they start to question just about everything. They're going to challenge some old ideas, one of which, things like religious dogma. Do you just simply abide by what's written in the Bible and taking it word for word? And other, not just within the scope of the Bible, but there has been so much that has been laid out by priests and the Pope and other leaders of the Christian church over time that is set as Christian traditions. Do you challenge those? Do you challenge the metaphysical? Oh, look, there's a shooting star that goes across space here. What could that mean? That is an omen that good is going to come or bad is going to come. A plague is coming, or your marriage is going to be fantastic. You're going to have multiple. Look, the metaphysical, right? Making conclusions that are in a lot of ways irrational based off of a limited understanding of how the world functions. And in doing so, superstition and ignorance, right? If I uh, do this, if I take this flour and I put it into a mixture, then my wife is going to have a child and survive childbirth and so forth, right? So ignorance, superstition, those things will be challenged by many Enlightenment thinkers because they say this is irrational, it is not reasonable. And particularly the notion of the divine right of kings, that God has appointed rulers and therefore we must follow these fallible men. Okay? They're going to see this and say, look, what gives them the right to rule? Because they came out of the right woman and from the right parentage. Okay? This makes no sense. And this particularly will be challenged. Okay? And others. And again, that's directly connected with things like aristocracy, birthright, primogeniture, that the eldest son gets everything, and even the notion of heredity. Who your parents are matters for everything. So the Enlightenment is going to include a number of different elements. The first of which is that we've talked about the roots of the Enlightenment from the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. But the basic idea is that rational law can describe social behavior. We can figure out the best ways to conduct affairs between people in creating rational laws for everybody to follow. And not only that, but that understanding knowledge, understanding the world, not focusing on ignorance, can improve public policy, how we engage with one another. And so we're going to examine some examples of what this might look like in this following slides. The first of which is regarding crime. Okay. One, Cesare Beccaria, an Italian philosopher, says basically this, right? In the old days, there is the way that Europeans would punish somebody is with torture, right? You would execute somebody in some of the most terrible ways possible, right? You may execute them through torture, right? What we call drawing and quartering, where you would take the appendages of a person, right? Their hands, their feet, and you would tie them up to horses, and then those horses would start to pull, and so you would get your shoulders and your dislocated, and your arms and your legs dislocated, such that you would feel the pain, right? So that you would torture somebody, right? Or you would throw them in an isolated prison with no windows and no sense of day or night, prison, where they're just basically living in their own filth, right? And so that's the type of punishment that exists in the ancient past. But Cesare Beccaria says, look, what's the point of that? Like, if we're going to punish somebody, it should be for the sake, not of punishment, but for reform. So in other words, you put them and you want to find them a way to reintegrate them into society. Because if you torture somebody, they're going to get worse, right? They're not going to get better, right? So Beccaria says, look, we need to educate people in prison, give them a chance to write, make it so to read and to write, to be able to better themselves, such that when they re-enter into society, they can actually rejoin, make things better once again. And so, in terms of punishment, Beccaria is saying the reasonable thing to do is to grow people and not to punish them. Or not to torture them in a way where they can't re-engage with society as a whole. In regards to politics, right, the whims of one man is irrational. We all have good and bad days, bad moods and so forth. We can't do justice by feelings, right? But instead, planned constitutions will be the means of control over giving rights of individuals because they're privileged by heredity. In regards to economics, a philosopher by the name of Adam Smith says, look, human competition should drive the growth of wealth. And that, in the end, will make society better. We'll look more into this later on in our class. So with that, the second question, examine the initial condition that's laid out and talk about one, proposed change by Enlightenment thinkers and why they're going to try to alter the society. In other words, what about the past does not make sense and what do they wish to change? So select one change, not all, and explain how it's trying to alter society for the better. So go ahead and pause the video here and answer this second question. Now, there are some changes about the Enlightenment by these hereditary rulers because they say, hey, you know what, some of this stuff actually does make sense. And so some absolute rulers will make certain reforms using Enlightenment ideas. And so what we're going to take a look at are some samples of this, of what are called enlightened despots. People like Franz Joseph of Austria, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and also Catherine the Great, who is also a ruler of Russia after Peter, who did things to such as commissioning a group to review laws to make sure that they make sense or not. Some of the stuff are old, and they don't apply anymore to a modern society. And so she has a commission to review laws. She issued policies of religious tolerance. Eastern Orthodoxy, a version of Christianity, was the primary religion of the Russian state, but allowing for other groups to be tolerated within her realm. And she also relaxed censorship, the freedom of the speech and press, encourage education amongst her people. Would be one example of implementing Enlightenment ideals within their realms. Okay. Another would be Frederick the Great. And so if you could go and use the links provided to take a look at chapter 3, lesson 3 of your textbook, and be able to identify two parts of the rule of Frederick the Great that would show his rule and how he demonstrate characteristics of the Enlightenment despite being an absolute ruler. So again, pause the video here and go and answer this section if it has been required in the listing in Google Classroom. Finally, we're going to take a look at samples of Enlightenment thinkers, the philosophers, or in French, just simply the philosophes, the intelligent, reasonable men, and I would add in women as well, who rationally analyzed society and called for dramatic change. So Enlightenment thinkers, like Thomas Hobbes, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Baron de Montesquieu, an aristocrat in France, John Locke, Mary Wollstonecraft, and finally, a Frenchman by the name of Voltaire. And as with these thinkers, we're going to go and engage in our own salon. Okay, so in other words, we're going to discuss and we're going to talk about this. So you have been assigned one philosopher. Okay? And in doing so, there are 12 questions that you're going to answer about that philosopher and also a primary source document to read. Okay? And so from that task that I'm going to assign in just a moment here, you're going to answer those questions and complete a graphic on the primary source document. Okay? And so in order to engage in our activity in the next class period, you're going to go ahead and answer those questions and stop where the document tells you to stop. Okay? If you don't do this, however, you're not going to be able to participate in our activity in class. So with that, click on the link that's provided. You should be able to find your name and also a philosopher that you have been assigned to. And with that, complete the Google Classroom assignment up to where it says the end of day 1, and you will be ready to go for our class activity. Okay. And so therefore, the required task is for you to go ahead and click on the philosopher you've been assigned, and then from there, once again, answer those 12 questions that are placed. And then finally, there is a primary source document that you're going to evaluate and you're going to summarize. Do not use artificial intelligence for any of these particular parts. However, there is a part where you can. There's an optional section whereby you can go ahead and ask AI about your individual's view on politics, religion, and society and be able to write down one fact that AI generates for you. So again, we're going to try to implement this to the best of our ability, but this is an optional task. It will help you in our class discussion later. Okay, complete this task and we're going to examine the philosophers of the Enlightenment tomorrow.